G'day guys, welcome back to another second gear low video. Today we're going to be changing the fuel filter on this 1997 Toyota Landcruiser 80 series with the 4.5 litre straight 6 1FZ-FE petrol engine. But the video is going to apply to all Landcruisers with that same engine, including some 70, 80 and 105 series cruisers. Now normally changing the fuel filter is a pretty straightforward job, but in this particular car it's in a bit of an awkward position to get to, so we'll be showing you some little tips and tricks we've picked up along the way. So let's jump right in. You can check out the description below for a full list of tools and parts, as well as timestamps if you'd like to skip ahead. We've got a jack and jack stand, along with a metric socket set with 12, 17 and 21mm sockets with various extensions to suit. We've got a torque wrench, a flathead screwdriver, a small plastic container with some paper towel or rags, and some nitrile gloves and safety glasses for protection. For the parts we're going to be installing, here's the genuine fuel filter part number from Toyota. Now when you open up the box, it actually comes with 4 new gaskets, but if you need to buy any additional ones, there's the part number for those. If you're not sure how long ago your banjo bolts were replaced, which are the bolts that hold the fuel lines into each end of the fuel filter, they're very inexpensive and it's a good idea to buy 2 of those as well, but mine were replaced quite recently. Now that's everything you need to do the job, but the method that we're going to be showing involves slotting one of the holes at the end of the fuel filter, which makes it significantly easier to install the new one. And if you want to follow that method, you'll also need a hacksaw, a file, a paintbrush and some black touch-up paint. As always, make sure you chock your wheels before you get underneath the car. So the first thing we need to do is to disconnect the fuel pump connector, which is part of the process for reducing the fuel pressure in those fuel lines. Now the connector is located just in front of the left rear wheel, just next to the chassis rail up here. So take your flathead screwdriver, there's a little tab just at the end of the clip here, and we just need to pull that down towards us. And when you do that, it's going to pull the tab up over a little ridge there and allow you to pull it apart. So basically you put your screwdriver in there, lift the tab and pull apart in one motion. And there it is. So we're going to leave that disconnected for now and we'll come back and reconnect that later on. So with the power to the fuel pump disconnected, we're just going to try and start the car, and it's either going to start and die very quickly or it's just going to keep turning over. We're going to do that for a few seconds and that's going to relieve that fuel pressure. And there we go. Now when we go and remove the fuel filter, there'll be a lot less fuel that's going to spill out. Next up, we're going to remove the front left wheel to give us better access. So grab your 21mm socket and we're just going to crack each of those 6 wheel nuts while the car's still on the ground. Then we'll grab our jack and our jack stand and we'll get this wheel up in the air. Then we can remove the wheel nuts and take the wheel off. At this point we want to remove the factory trim cover panel that sits along here, which is held in by clips in the body and in the chassis rail, and that's going to give you access to your fuel filter, which is located up behind here. In this case that panel's already been removed previously. Quick safety pause. At this point we're going to be removing fuel lines from the old fuel filter and you are going to spill some petrol. So it's really important to do this in a well ventilated area and to make sure that there's no ignition sources around. It can also be a pretty good idea to keep a fire extinguisher handy as well if you've got one. Looking from the top of the engine bay on the left hand side, there's your engine oil dipstick there. The fuel filter is located just down here. I'm just touching one of the fuel lines there, so it can be a bit tricky to get to. So we're going to be using a combination of getting to it from the top in the engine bay and also from underneath through where that wheel was removed from. You want to have your plastic container with some paper towels in it ready to go nearby just to catch any spillage, but we're going to start just by cracking the 2 17mm banjo bolts, which are located on each end of the fuel filter, front and back, and they're holding the fuel lines in place. So we found the easiest way to get these is with a 17mm socket from in the engine bay up the top. It's worth noting it's important to loosen these while the fuel filter is still mounted to the top, because otherwise you're going to bend the hard line. So once that's cracked, I can just loosen it and remove it the rest of the way by hand, and I've just got my container ready to catch any of that spillage. You can see there's a decent amount of fuel just pouring out now. So make sure you remove the 2 old washers from each of the banjo bolts. We're going to replace those. If you don't know how old they are, it's a really good idea to replace your banjo bolts when you do this job as well. They're pretty cheap and readily available from Toyota. It's important to note as well that just behind the fuel filter, there's a knock sensor located quite close by. It's really important that you're careful not to bump that sensor because you might damage it and they're quite expensive to replace. Now we're going to do the same thing for the 17mm banjo bolt on the back side of the fuel filter where the hard line is, and again 17mm socket from the top side in the engine bay. Again, make sure you have your paper towel ready to catch any spillage. So again, we can throw away those 2 copper washers and that paper towel. Now it's time to remove the 2 mounting bolts, which sit vertically and hold the fuel filter onto the car. So there's one here and then one in the same position on the other side. I've found the easiest way to get these is using a 12mm socket from the top side. You've just got to get a combination that's the right length of extensions to fit in behind the fuel filter. There we go, that's the first bolt out. So these little bolts that hold the fuel filter in that have the captive washer can be replaced quite cheaply from Toyota as well. And again, this second one isn't too hard to get with a 12mm socket and some extensions. It's a good idea to have some paper towel ready because if the fuel filter tips when you remove it, it might leak some fuel. So try and keep that horizontal when you get it out from the engine bay. So in order to make the job a little bit easier, because it is quite difficult to get these 2 mounting bolts in on the new filter, we're just going to slot out one of the 2 bolts, and that's going to make it significantly easier to install. The one that you want to slot is the one that sits further away from the fuel filter, so a bit higher up. So we'll pop that in the vise. Don't need to clamp it too hard, and we're just going to grab the hacksaw and just slot out that hole to the top. Then we'll grab a file and just quickly clean up the edge. And then lastly, we're just going to apply a little bit of black touch-up paint, just to make sure that's not going to rust. And then we'll leave that to dry before we install it. So with the filter removed, you can now clearly see the 2 bolt holes where those 12mm mounting bolts go. And at this point, because we've slotted the back hole on the new filter, we're going to be able to partially install that bolt and then slide the filter on afterwards. But if you're not slotting the hole on the new filter, you'll need to install the new filter and both bolts at the same time. So we'll just get that started by hand, and then we're going to be able to slot the filter through there. It's personal preference, but some people might find it easier at this point to install the front banjo bolt with the flexible fuel line before you actually install the mounting bolts into the fuel filter, but I prefer to install the fuel filter onto the car first. So I'm going to slide the slot in the fuel filter up over where that washer and bolt were, and then we can install the second 12mm bolt. Once they've both made contact, we'll tighten them up. There is a torque spec for these, and it's 15 foot-pounds or 21 Newton meters, but we found it's pretty difficult to get a torque wrench in there, so we're just going to snug them down using a 12mm socket. Grab 2 of the new gaskets that came with the fuel filter and the first of our 2 banjo bolts. We're going to slide one of the gaskets onto the banjo bolt. Make sure to check as well that you don't have any of your old gaskets stuck to any of these surfaces. Then we're going to put the bolt through the flexible line. And then your second gasket goes on the other side of the flexible line on the bolt. And then we can feed it into this front side of the filter. You'll notice that there's a slot in the filter for this hard section of the line to fit into. And we're just going to finger tight this for now. So grab the other 2 gaskets and the other banjo bolt, and again slide one of the gaskets onto the bolt, and we're going to have the second gasket on the other side of the hard line. So we'll pop the bolt through the hard line. This one's pretty fiddly. We're going to try and get the gasket in between the hard line and the filter. Then we want to just try and get that banjo bolt started into the filter. And again, this one takes a 17mm socket as well. So now that we've got both of the banjo bolts seated, it's time to tighten them up. There is a torque spec for these. It's 22 foot-pounds or 29 Newton meters. But again, you're going to have a hard time getting a torque wrench in there. So we're just going to snug these down as well. Now that the fuel filter is installed, we need to reconnect the fuel pump connector just in front of the rear left wheel, which we disconnected earlier. So the way that you do that is you just push these 2 parts together and you'll feel that little tab will slot in here and click. And then once it's connected, just make sure it can't pull apart. So we're going to start the car now and check for any leaks around the new fuel filter. Before we do that though, we're just going to prime it. And the way that we do that is we just put the key in and turn it to the on position. Then the fuel pump will be running. We'll leave it there for a few seconds before we start the car. So now we'll jump in the engine bay and check for any leaks. So we've checked for leaks and there weren't any, which is great. At this point, if you had the side engine bay cover, make sure you put that back on. And now we're going to put the wheel back on as well. Then we're just going to snug each of those down with a 21mm socket. We'll torque them properly when the car's back on the ground. Next up, we'll jump underneath the car, lift it with the jack and remove the jack stand. And then we can lower it back down. So lastly, we just need to torque up our wheel nuts. And for the 80 series with alloy wheels like this one, we're going to tighten to 76 foot-pounds or 103 Newton meters. But if you have the steel wheels, it's 109 foot-pounds or 147 Newton meters. So grab your 21mm socket on the torque wrench. So that's it for changing the fuel filter on the 1FZ-FE. If you've got any future videos you'd like to see or any other feedback for us, we'd love to hear it down in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.